Good morning, everyone. My name is David Thatcher, BSI's Head of Sector for Environment, Social and Governance. And on behalf of BSI, a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us in this breakout session on net zero. A brief word about the format of this session. I'll let the panelists briefly introduce themselves and the projects they're leading on, and then we'll have a discussion about how these initiatives are supporting organisations on the net zero transition and what barriers may remain. We'll then open up the floor to your questions, and I think you should be able to post those through the normal Zoom channels. I should put this into some kind of context, not least that our own collective response to a global pandemic has, and the impact that's had in terms of interruption to business operations, has, I think, arguably foreshadowed the many stress scenarios that businesses will have to anticipate as a consequence of climate change. As the UK's national standards body, it is our role, as I'm sure you know, to convene experts, subject matter experts drawn from a range of informed stakeholders, and develop a suite of good practice standards that address the challenge of decarbonising industry through credible means for quantifying, reducing, offsetting and reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. One sector, energy, needs to make that transition at some pace, in part because it can enable change across all vertical sectors. And we'll hear more about that shortly. At BSI, we also say that standards enable innovation, collaboration, and acceleration, and those seem to be all equally relevant to the debate we're having this morning, and the road we are on together. The need to then therefore pull together in one direction will also come up later. As for BSI's own message to the market in 2021, we have proactively designed a suite of reference materials and tools that seek to inform, and what follows are just a few examples. You can find out more at www.bsigroup.com net zero. In January, we published our first net zero business barometer. That's an assessment of where businesses are now in the transition to net zero, what changes they have committed to, and equally what barriers they still face. This is being revised as I speak for 2022. So it'll be interesting to see the difference, hopefully the progression that organisations are making in this year. We also hosted a week of net zero webinars in January. Those took a sector-based approach to the issues. Later, that industry lens was applied further with our net zero infographic. This provides a tour through all the relevant standards needed to support businesses on that journey, and includes sector-specific standards and guidance. It also includes the BSI standard as 2060 on carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality, a term used and frequently misunderstood in the context of net zero, and we may touch upon that as well. And we've just relaunched our little book of net zero. That's guidance aimed primarily at the SME market. And last month, we were especially pleased that the UK government's net zero strategy recognised the role of standards and BSI. And that does seem like a good segue to hand over to our first panellists. So I'd like to say hello to Catherine Westerby, Net Zero Business Engagement Lead at BEIS. If you're there, Catherine. Yes, you are. Brilliant. Great. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Yes, hello David, and morning everyone. It's lovely to be here speaking to you all today. As you know, COP has just finished, so we're still sort of in the aftermath and sort of looking at all the things we achieved in the run up to that. And just to give myself a bit more of an introduction, so yes, I am the Net Zero Business Engagement Lead for BEIS. I also led over the course of the past year the Small Business Engagement Campaign in the run up to COP26, working for our Net Zero Business Champion Andrew Griffith MP, which was I think a unique opportunity really to touch base with lots of businesses who had been really hard hit by the pandemic, who are obviously still struggling to an extent. So it was a really great opportunity to, as I say, engage with small businesses in particular, who, as we know, make up almost all of the business community in the UK. Over 99% of businesses in the UK are small or medium-sized enterprises. So again, it was a really good opportunity to touch base with them. And our campaign primarily was focused on raising awareness of net zero, because we know that small businesses in particular don't have, much of a grasp of what net zero actually means. They might understand climate change, for example. It might be something, again, that they are very sort of committed to tackling, but they just don't know where to start or what they should be doing and what net zero actually means for them as a business. So that's what we've tried to do with this campaign, is sort of translate net zero into meaningful, tangible actions that small businesses can take in order to become a net zero business. And obviously the first step is to visit the SME Climate Hub and to make the SME climate commitments. That way businesses can join the UN-led Race to Zero, which we are, again, very much part of. So it was a really useful opportunity, again, to sort of get that message, that core message across, that net zero is good for business. And we've obviously been working very closely with BSI in particular to understand the really important role that standards can play in that, in just simplifying and clarifying and bringing people together to understand that we're working towards a common goal, and that, again, standards are a great way of fostering that sort of collaboration on net zero in particular, which is, which can be a very tricky policy area.
Great, thank you, Catherine, for that. And obviously, always good to hear sort of warm, encouraging words from government in terms of the role that standards can play, and BSI as a kind of collaborative partner. I'd like to now turn to you, Seb Van Dort, who's BSI's Associate Director of Energy.
I'm successfully unmuted. That took a while. So yes, I'm the Associate Director for Energy and Sustainability now, but my core focus has been on energy, and it's been a sort of exciting 2 years since I joined BSI. I think the whole sort of net zero journey has been sort of very exciting from an energy point of view. There's obviously a lot happening in energy. It's hitting the sort of headlines at the moment, but what we've been trying to do is really position standards to support, enable, and possibly accelerate the transition to net zero, and we do this in a variety of sectors. Obviously my focus is on energy, so I can really sort of talk about sort of the work that we've done in energy and how we're trying to do that. But for us, it's key to sort of look at, okay, what is the sort of net zero transition? What is the role of standards, and where are they best placed to support and enable this sort of transition? And in energy, that becomes sort of, apparent quite quickly. I mean, make no mistakes about it, the sort of transition to net zero is absolutely massive, and I sometimes think even people in various industries don't understand how big the transition is, and I think we're just starting to scratch the surface. If we look at energy, the energy transition has been going on for a while, in all fairness, but we are very much transitioning from an old analog system, and we're replacing that system with a completely new flexible systems, and what that means is the old grid has a few central generation plants, often based on fossil fuel, with a few sort of 100 players, and that's transitioning to a system where we have many different generation plants, completely decentralized, hundreds of millions of assets being able to sort of talk to the grid. And so you can often divide the grid into generation, transmission, distribution companies who operate in a local area, and then you have the energy suppliers who right at the front door take care of the billing. And that's very much a top-down view of energy, to say, what is the peak demand, how much do we need to generate, and how do we sort of push that down the line? This system is going to change completely. As we said, there's going to be hundreds of millions of assets talking on the system. So, different sources of energy, electric vehicles coming onto the grid, talking to the grid. And all these new systems need to be interoperable, need to be able to communicate and talk to one another. They also need to have the right securities, cyber security, but also data privacy. But above all, they need to provide that flexibility that the grid needs, and they need to provide that stability that you get with intermittent, that is very needed with intermittent renewables. And so for us, it was very clear that in order for all these systems to talk and to one another and be interoperable, we need standards. And so we had a very sort of receptive audience that sort of understands the need that standards play. And for us, what we started to do is really sort of dig into what are the big sort of areas that we could play a supporting role, and what are the programs of work that we need to do from a standards point of view. And so there's a number of big sort of programs, like the Energy Smart Appliances program of works, which sort of looks at the interoperability of smart appliances, which includes EV charge points. We looked at battery technology through the Faraday Battery Challenge. There's a lot of work that we did in the decarbonisation of heat, and particularly in the sort of hydrogen space. What we found out in that part is that obviously we convene, we bring all the experts together, and there seems to be a unique role for BSI to bring all of these players together, because we are a not-for-profit. We are separate from industry, but we're also separate from government. And so what we found with these programs is we bring all the experts together. We look at what are the big problems that we need to tackle, and then we look at, do standards play a role, and what standards play a role, and that often sort of results in a sort of road mapping exercise to say, there are standards here that can accelerate the hydrogen rollout, for instance, and here are the standards that we needed. I think the key part with that convening role is that it's experts saying what are the standards needed. It's not the national standards body saying we need standards here. It's actually all the experts in industry saying, if we want to have certain policy outcomes, this is where standards are needed to support and enable that net zero transition. And so that's very much a model that we are looking to sort of build out, to say, can we convene all the experts, look at the big sort of wider net zero transition, take a systems view, and what is our role in that transition, and how do we best place, to support that transition. And that might mean, a new standard, but that also might mean better use of existing standards or the adoption of global standards. But most importantly, that convening role allows us to really listen to industry and government, and then support that sort of wider transition. I hope that sort of provides a decent background there of what we've been trying to do.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Seb. Thanks. I think I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was interesting, because I think I'll come on to Dan in a sec, and I'm not now going over to kind of the discussion part of the breakout, but I guess I'll return to this. But in a way, I think we've heard from Catherine the fact that businesses need some kind of knowledge and guidance, and it's very much sometimes the nuts and bolts in terms of behaviour change. And then obviously, Seb, what you've talked about is the role of where knowledge is needed more from, I suppose, in lay terms, the plumbing side of the energy market, and how everything kind of connects up with each other, particularly with this sort of transition that industry is going through. So I think it maybe indicates that, to me anyway, that there's obviously a need for knowledge and good practice across that domain, and the behaviour side is where perhaps BSI traditionally hasn't been. It's been more in the technical stuff, which it still needs to be. But I think that just in a way shows you that there's so much more to kind of that hopefully we can contribute to this discussion. And that I suppose maybe brings me to Dan and your role in terms of how we can be more innovative, support innovation, but actually be more innovative in terms of how we actually shape solutions as well. Dan Barlow.
Great, thank you. So as you say, I'm Dan Barlow. My role is Head of Innovation Policy at BSI, which typically means I'm talking to government and to innovators and business about how standards can be used to innovate in technology, in governance, in policy and strategies, that sort of thing. But actually, the reason I'm here is to talk to you about a project that I'm in the core team for, which is called R2050 World. So R2050 World is looking at all standards. It's not just looking at the international system that that everyone here will know and love. And it's a collaboration, this project, between BSI, ISO, and the Race to Zero campaign that Catherine already mentioned. And this collaboration has been formed earlier this year, but quite recently, to support non-state actors to accelerate their race to zero and enable the planet to halve emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest. So through this program so far, we've identified there's 3 sorts of interventions that this collaboration can use to accelerate that race to zero and the halving of emissions, and then net zero. And those revolve around 3 things, and Seb's mentioned 2 of them already. So the first is signposting, so pointing to existing standards that already exist. The second one is align, so that might be building or trying to streamline existing standards so that they're aligned. And the final one is cascade, so how do we use this system and drive it through voluntary initiatives such as, for example, SBTI or the Race to Zero campaign, into the standards world that we know, the international standards world, and then through into regulation. So those are sort of 3 intervention areas. And then we've done a couple of pieces of research looking at where we can best use these interventions. So one has been through stakeholder research with experts from around the world. And one was specifically looking at consumers, citizens, and the general public and their attitudes towards net zero. And through that research, we've identified 3 areas that we really want to focus in early next year. And these are reducing variation in targets, measures, and reporting around net zero. So we know there is too many definitions and there is divergence of definitions around net zero. This, again, as Seb said, this is a complicated space, and we're just scratching the surface. So we think we can bring some more clarity there. The second area, and this sort of links very well to what Catherine was talking about, we know that some businesses, particularly smaller businesses, but also many businesses in the global south, struggle to find pragmatic information on what they should do, and it's not very accessible. So how do we make sure that standards are helping organizations to change, helping them on this journey to race to get to net zero as quickly and as efficiently as possible, and also, again, as Catherine said, making sure that the benefits of reaching net zero are really well communicated. And the final area is around innovation. So it sort of brings me right back to my core role. So we know that there's a lot of innovation going on in this space, but it is a huge challenge. So how do we unlock the scale of innovation that's required to get us to a really transformed global economy? Because it's not going to be through quite small transitional step-by-step approaches. We need some really, really big thinking, and standards clearly has a big role in terms of helping organizations to understand the size of change that they need to make, and also get on the tracks to make those changes. Thank you very much, David.
Great, thanks, Dan. So we have had a few questions coming through both on the chat and in the Q&A. But I think one thing I was just thinking about, really, you touched upon, Catherine, the SME, is it the Climate Action Hub or SME Climate Hub? I should know the answer to this.
The SME Climate Hub.
Climate Hub. And one thing I'm aware of is I think that our own net zero barometer, the one I referred to that came out in January this year, said that organizations are really kind of crying out for guidance. And in fact, one of the questions was, I need more guidance on scope 3 emissions, for example. But equally, I know that hub is obviously a kind of a meeting place, or even a marketplace for organizations that are providing sort of information to SMEs. I mean, it's that kind of paradox of almost like there's either feast or famine. There's either maybe not enough information, or there's so much information it's maybe difficult to know where to turn to. Just out of interest on the SME Climate Hub, I mean, how is that managed in terms of what information is posted onto that, and which organizations can join that particular sort of marketplace or that meeting place?
No, I completely agree. I mean, your assessment there is spot on in terms of, there's often, a complete absence of information, or there's too much, and that for a small business, again, in particular, is almost impossible to navigate. And I think that's what we've tried to do. Just turn my camera off, there we go. I think that's what we've tried to do with the SME Climate Hub and working with that international partnership, is to try and sort of simplify everything for small businesses. So we're not going to pretend that it's perfect or that everything we want is on there at this stage. I think what we've tried to do is kind of triage, the most important information for small businesses. We've worked with countless user panels over the past year to make sure that the information, advice and guidance on there is the right information for small businesses in particular. And it is absolutely, a mammoth task to start unpicking everything, because there's so many organisations who want to support. We've got some fantastic advice from Carbon Trust. There always has been, in terms of guidance for small businesses in particular. So again, what we've tried to do is simplify it. And I would like to point out that obviously the SME Climate Hub, we have a great partnership with them. It's a great resource, a great tools library, for example, that we have on there. But I think what we're eventually working towards is potentially a one-stop shop advice service. Now, that could be obviously pulled together by governments. And I don't want to suggest that we have all the answers, or that, that we are sort of responsible for putting all the information on there, because clearly, again, there are so many different stakeholders, including yourselves, that we would want to work with to start pulling that information together and drawing out the right type of guidance. Again, I think that's really important, especially when we're talking about standards, to say, look, we don't need to put everything on there. We just need to put the right information on there to allow businesses to start their net zero journey. And we need to help them set credible milestones, etc. We need to help them plan that journey. What does it look like for you as a business? So I think there's an awful lot more still to do that we want to do as part of our post-COP legacy, is again to sort of present that and to coordinate it really from governments, and obviously including other stakeholders as well. But it's a challenge.
It certainly is. And I think, Dan, just picking up on what you said in your piece there about R2050 World, or 2050 .world, to quote the URL. I mean, what Catherine I think is saying is that yes, that sort of information hub is going to have a lot of different types of advice and suppliers and providers of services. In terms of the standards, unraveling or the kind of scrambling what standards are what, that's really at the heart of what R2050 World is all about. So do you feel that that's the point at which maybe once we've in a way helped in a way simplify the different standards and codes and frameworks that are out there, that's the point where maybe we can start to kind of reconnect with BEIS in terms of where the climate hub and what we're doing kind of converge. And therefore I'm hoping what we can say is that when organizations say, well, we need more guidance on standards, but we're perhaps we're rabbit in the headlights, we're not quite sure which standards are appropriate, then by the work we're doing, then that maybe neatly aligns with what the work that Catherine's doing in BEIS and then the Climate Hub, and it all hopefully sort of fits together like a jigsaw piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's difficult to give a really concrete answer on that. So we know we need to reduce variation, but I think almost to the point you were exploring just previously, there's sometimes too much information, there's sometimes too little information, and you need to make sure that the right information is getting to the right actors at the right time, but also that the sort of the framework of information that sits behind that, so it might not actually be the information you want to deliver directly to SMEs or other non-state actors, is sort of as complicated, but you need this framework behind it. So actually what we're looking at doing, and it's not something that we can say exactly the intervention straight away, is do an assessment of all the standards that exist, both in our international system and through voluntary initiatives, and work out where those points of variation are. So for example, the one-stop shop that Catherine speaks about is I haven't looked at it in detail, but it's probably very good and very useful for SMEs. But there might be a problem if those standards vary between SMEs and corporates, and they're trying to drive down reductions in emissions across their supply chain. How do they do that in a consistent way? There's a question from Ben Kirkman in the chat rather than the Q&A, talking about what key standards are required to make the transition to net zero. And it's not, I think there's two things. There's standards that are to do with net zero, and then there's all the standards that define the world that we work in at the moment, the market framework that we're in at the moment. And they're probably, I would say, few of them are actually compatible with the 2050 world that we're going into. So I think that it's quite a complex answer. So there's things that we can do straight away. So we can probably look at bringing in a framework standard. I think that's probably what we'll look to do, but we need to assess it, because we don't want to just put standards on top of standards. But actually the more complicated and more impactful question is, how do you align the standards that exist already, both specifically for net zero, but also the economy more broadly?
Yeah, and I think the question we set ourselves on this breakout, which is quite a mammoth one, as I think Seb alluded to, how do we get to net zero by 2050? We're obviously going to focus our energies in this sort of the last 20 minutes and the next 20 minutes when we take questions from the audience, in terms of through the lens of how standards of good practice can help us get to net zero. There are many ways in which we can get to net zero, but I think we're only really charged with how we can raise the profile of existing standards, to Ben's point. And I think the URL listed on the slide here, Ben will, I think, hopefully provide you the way there. The infographic is a very quick tour through the key standards you really need to get your head around in terms of assessing, managing, reducing, offsetting when needed, and also reporting in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But yeah, we can't boil the ocean on this session, obviously. But Seb, you had your hand up there, and one question I was going to ask you actually was really about these technical standards you talked about before, the ones which obviously enable innovation in the sector, but the relevance of those to SMEs and how they maybe can look at moving to LED lighting in their offices and the like, and where standards can play a role there. But you had a question maybe, or point to make anyway.
Yeah. So my initial sort of hand up was to sort of come in on sort of Catherine's sort of points. She made a sort of few very good points, and I've been part of a few sort of sessions looking at this, and I think one of those things for me that is sort of very clear is that net zero is sort of a journey, right? And particularly when you look at it at a SME point of view, as you said, there's either not enough information or too much information. I think, we need imperfect action and sort of look at the next steps rather than looking at the journey of 2050 and net zero. So providing that guidance and simplifying is absolutely the right point, but also, being aware that, taking the first step is sort of the best step you can take, because sometimes people, particularly at SMEs, that look at net zero in such a complex problem to unpick, which sort of then becomes sort of inaction, right? So it's almost lowering the threshold and saying what is the first sort of step or action that you can take as a SME, which is relatively painless and which provides a sort of return on investment. That would be sort of a good starting point, right? Because as we say, most large corporates have the resources to do this, but they're 1%. The SMEs are 99%. So imperfect action by the 99% beats perfect action by the 1%, right? So that's sort of that's sort of the point that I wanted to make, is I hear quite a lot of how do we unpick net zero, particularly from the SME point of view. But taking the next step seems to be sort of the best thing. And go on.
Well, I was just going to say, so something like obviously there are organizations out there that provide services in terms of switching between providers and in terms of energy. So, and many of those energy providers are saying, well, actually we are 100% renewable, and that's obviously the means by which an SME can then move to a energy provider. Now, in terms of the kind of the more almost like meta work that we're doing on, say, hydrogen, that's not going to have a direct impact on an SME. The fact that we might publish, as we have done, for example, standards which are enabling hydrogen to be a viable alternative energy source. But can you maybe articulate how what we're doing at that high altitude level can at some point then inform the decisions that maybe an SME can play when they're informed about the value of moving to more renewables? And do you feel there's a gap there for where BSI can play? It's the technical stuff that we said beforehand is really important, but we also need to provide guidance on how organizations can move to more renewable energy sources. Is that something that we should be playing in that space?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's quite a lot that we can do there and that we are doing. And obviously energy sort of by nature is slightly sort of more technical, but it's that sort of enabling thing, right? If you sort of decarbonize your energy supply, then, like SMEs will be able to have a lower carbon footprint, but by virtue of, being able to allow more renewables to come on board. If you want to look at decarbonizing heat and you use hydrogen for that, then again, as a SME, you sort of lower your sort of carbon footprint there. But again, the impact on some of these things are, so in the chat I saw past 1878 and 1879 that the standards that are sort of very close to my heart, because I think they are genuinely game changing. We, as part of that, of the Energy Smart Appliances program that I mentioned, we looked at global gaps, and there was a gap in the global market to allow that sort of interoperability. Now, if you're a SME, you can then start looking for appliances that are compliant with past 1878 and 1879, and know that they give you both the right sort of securities, but also that they allow that flexibility to go back into the grid. And this will be particularly relevant if you start looking at, the best sort of next step for a lot of SMEs would be to sort of look at their cars and use electric cars. Well, if you don't have a charger that's past 1878 compliant, you know that your car will be able to talk to the grid and provide that sort of much needed flexibility. So again,
just to expand, in case people didn't know, those standards that are quoted, I think by Jim, thank you, Jim, PAS 1878, they're specifically about charging points for electric vehicles.
Yeah, so they're energy smart appliances, which include 6 types of appliances. I can't remember them from the top of my head, but called wet appliances, but also EV charge points are part of that basically, and so they then provide that sort of flexibility that the grid needs, and there's a lot of benefits from a grid point of view, and then that becomes a sort of wider transition to sort of net zero. So even those technical standards operate on that sort of almost unseen sort of level, but they definitely have a big impact in shifting the moving the needle on net zero, really.
Yeah. So that's my point, I suppose. The SME themselves won't be maybe the user of that standard because they're used by those actors in that particular supply chain, but it maybe means that an SME wishing to transfer its fleet to EVs can maybe start to become more aware of standards work that's happening, so they can make some choices informed by the fact that there is good practice that is starting to kind of permeate the market, which is being shaped by BSI. Is that the kind of the story?
Yes, exactly. And Jim points out also heat pumps. So yeah, I know there was stuff that I'd probably miss off. But yeah, so if let's say you have a charge that isn't past 8078 and 8079 compliant, we're going to getting quite specific now, but it's recommended in the smart charging regulation to be compliant with past 1878 and 1879. But if it's not compliant with it, it might not provide that flexibility, which means that you can shave off the peak loads and reduce emissions that way. So again, looking at those standards, you know that you have to sort of best practice in reducing emissions for that area, and that you're able to provide that sort of flexibility, which you might not be able to do if your charger isn't compliant with those standards.
Okay, great. There's a question from Jim actually to I guess to Catherine, but I'm wondering, well, you may be able to see yourself actually, what's top of BEIS's list of essential international net zero standards apart from PAS 1878, 1879? Catherine, I mean, you don't have to answer that question because I'm sure you haven't got your own desert island discs of standards to kind of quote from. But you mentioned before that you see what we're supporting through convening experts and shaping standards of good practice, as Seb said beforehand, is really definitely supporting BEIS's bigger ambition, and the fact that BSI and standards specifically was cited within the net zero strategy is resulting in a way of our own partnership with yourselves. But do you believe that standards really play a critical part in unlocking the opportunity for how organizations can kind of reach the 2050 target?
Oh, certainly. I mean, that's the key word, really, opportunity. And this, again, is about communicating clearly to businesses where the opportunities lie. I think, again, what we're hearing back off when, you've spoken about best practice. I mean, they want to know that they're getting it right. They don't want, especially smaller businesses, don't want to be spending or investing lots of money at this stage on something that perhaps isn't the right way to go or won't be recognised. I think we get a lot of questions around accreditation. How do I prove that I'm a net zero business, for example? And again, not to get into the nitty-gritty of that question, which is can be a little controversial, but just to say again, it is such an important step, to see standards as a key net zero enabler. And that's again what we were focused on in the net zero strategy, is focusing on where those enablers are and how we leverage those to get some momentum. So absolutely, completely agree.
And one question we've got so I'm moving more to the kind of open Q&A now, actually, from Sharon Heenan, needing more guidance on scope 3. So I guess I'm sure all of you on the call probably are aware of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. And within, I think, PAS 2060, those are referred to as being direct or indirect. So scope 1 being direct, those that an organization has more control over, and it's obviously related in a way to the different sort of layers within a supply chain. So Sharon, you don't say whether you're needing more guidance in terms of consultation to come in, someone to help you assess those, or whether how to reduce those, but that within a standard like PAS 2060 there is certainly guidance on indirect emissions, which scope 3 would fall under, and those standards that are listed on the net zero URL we've got on the slide here and within our infographic do provide more, do expand more in terms of how you can quantify emissions at that indirect and direct level. But I think probably again the climate, the SME climate hub, I think that Catherine was talking about, will probably also help you identify maybe some organizations that supply services specifically targeted towards how you can actually quantify and then actually reduce your scope 3 emissions. There was a question from Richard Collin, who I think is from UCAS, and really picking up on the point you made, Catherine, about trust and transparency, and maybe organizations that want to not just take a standard of good practice and embed it within their organization, but have that then assessed by a third party. As again, many of you on the call will know, standards, and this is actually back to something that Seb alluded to, BSI in a way doesn't shape or control the shape of the solution. It's the experts we convene. Sometimes a standard based on that expertise will emerge as guidance, particularly when it's more of a nascent type of concept. Other times it can be shaped to be written for assessment purposes. And such a standard can then support a scheme which then has organisations that provide those services, and UCAS do a great job in providing accreditation so that the market has some degree of assurance that those organisations that are accredited to provide certain services really have been sort of verified by UCAS as having competent auditors. So I think Richard's point, which is, I'm trying to read it as I talk here actually, encouraging to hear about the development of standards, interested to know how organisations trust that others in their supply chain are meeting standards and how consumers make informed choices. I think again, it's this kind of thread of trust that comes maybe from those standards that are written to be assessed, and therefore the role that I think that UCAS can provide also in providing that trust that the market is functioning, that organisations that are accredited to provide services provide that to a competent level. But I think Catherine alluded to that before. It can be a bit of a minefield. We haven't used the word greenwash. I've just used it now. But I think in terms of do the panel here have any views on how, in a potentially a bit of a Wild West environment, that certain services can so I'm just being distracted by Richard Collins' follow-up, that certain organisations can be credible in terms of the services they offer? How do we manage that to make sure that an SME in particular working on a small budget perhaps doesn't get kind of drawn into buying services from maybe the lowest price available, and actually therefore that service not having the credibility that they actually thought in the first place? How can we manage that, do we think?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. So I think it's a really good question from Richard, and it's something that I'd actually quite like to explore with him in the next couple of weeks. So one of the reactions or consequences of this variation that I spoke about into the standards around net zero is that variation causes confusion and inaction, and actually can be exploited so that organisations do as little as possible for the biggest gain. And that's where I think this sort of move across from voluntary initiatives that possibly are diverging into a single aligned way of measuring and thinking about net zero action is going to be really, really important, because, and it goes to Sharon's question about scope 3 emissions as well. You need to have consistency in your value chain to be able to know what you're doing and to report it. And indirect emissions, scope 3 emissions, is where it's going to be particularly difficult to do. And just earlier today, actually, we were thinking about sort of the hierarchy of emissions, and obviously it's quite easy to know what we're doing from a planetary point of view, and it's very easy to understand what net zero means for the planet. But actually, when you get into national commitments and measures, or when you get into non-state actors measures or value streams measures, and then to products and services and to processes below it, that's when it becomes far more difficult. And there's lots of different ways that we can look at measuring that and reporting that and trusting each other on that. But at the moment, there is too much variation. The only other thing that I would add, and Richard, you talk about it again in your question about trust in supply chains and consumers. I think all of this revolves around three types of actors in the space. There's the nations, so the governments and the regulators. There's the non-state actors, and the consumers. And from research, we know that there isn't one magic bullet that any one of those can fire. It's sort of cyclical. Everyone needs to be building their ambition. Everyone needs to be pushing in the right direction for us to get there. So we know that consumers, if you give them enough information, they will change their choices. But that's not very much. It's only about 2, 3, 5% at most, typically. But that can have a really big impact on what government are happy to do and what they're happy to regulate. And that can have obviously a big impact on companies trying to go further and lead. And that provides the market for consumers to want to do more. So I absolutely think there's a really, really important role for assurance, and there's a really important role for trust. I think it all comes down to trust that we're going to do this. And the final point, sorry, I've thought of one more. The UN Secretary General at COP referred to establishing a group of experts to propose clear standards to measure and analyze net zero commitments from non-state actors. So this is being looked at in quite a big way, and there is an understanding that greenwashing has no place in us trying to get to net zero. And how do you get rid of greenwashing? Well, you make sure there's clear standards and you make sure there's robust assurance and there's trust.
I think, yeah, I agree with that. I think the point actually Sharon made by way of a follow-up actually, and I think I know what she's alluding to here, it's about getting information from suppliers who maybe are themselves a little bit in the dark. Now, you made a really good point, Daniel, which is the fact that a lot of organizations are really trying their best. So if you are working through some sort of contractual relationship where what you're putting on a supplier who might be an SME is an obligation to be more transparent about emissions. If they say, well, we just don't know where to start, but to trust us, we're doing our very best. Is that a means to switch supplier and therefore cut that SME out of the loop? And how are they ever going to actually get back on on that ramp, as it were, and improve? I think I'm not really having I'm not really probably giving any opportunity to give any clear answer there, but I think that does become something which is a real challenge, I think, for SMEs in particular, which is we're doing our best, but maybe we can't meet with an existing standard. I think that, to me personally, provides an opportunity for BSI to provide more guidance, which is not lighter in that sense, but provides some kind of, like I say, ramp into this world for SMEs. The other point I'd also add, because I know we're closing soon, I don't want to just end with me talking and maybe give everyone a chance to respond. Adrian Miller points out that there's a standard for collaborative business relationships, ISO 44001. So again, we mustn't forget that actually, whilst there are many standards here relating to greenhouse gas management, and I mentioned before about the net zero URL there, where you can find many of those. There are lots of other standards that in their own way support how organizations can collaborate more effectively. And that could be what I'm alluding to with this idea of how you can have an SME within your supply chain that's doing their very utmost, haven't yet maybe met the high watermark of being certified to a standard, but at least you can kind of bring them along with you. And as you lead, then they become part of that sort of cohort that you're helping to improve along the way. Any thoughts on that, really? This idea that how larger organizations can almost, in a sort of altruistic sense, say, look, we're not going to cut you off because you haven't yet met with a certain standard, but we can support you in your own knowledge journey. Is there a role there for the standards and BSI there, Seb?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on that one because I find this quite an interesting one. Again, from an energy point of view, we do talk about a sort of just transition, and what you don't want to be doing, particularly from a SME point of view. There's 99% of SMEs. I think Catherine sort of mentioned that earlier. When we look at energy, we talk about a sort of just transition because there is a cost associated to net zero. When we talked previously about imperfect action, what you don't want to be doing is rewarding those SMEs who have more budget and who are able to sort of put resources behind this, because again, SMEs are a wide variety, right? So this is a transition, and you can't go from 0 to 100% net zero compliance in the next 12 months, right? So you've got to there is a big sort of piece for us to say, actually, how do we ensure that SMEs can take that first step on that journey? How can they, how can they show compliance or that they're taking the first steps? What it seems to me wholly impractical to say, actually, you're not complying to this standard, so you're not part of our supply chain anymore. To me, so I do believe there is a sort of timeline that you sort of support SMEs on that journey to demonstrate that compliance towards net zero and towards getting to grip with scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And it might well be that you first look at scope 1 emissions as part of your supply chain, is if your SME can demonstrate they're actively taking control of that. I think there is a wider piece where I think BSI really stands out, is that as the national standards body, the way we create standards is we bring all the experts together, but also wider societal interest groups like consumer interest groups. And I think that's the other sort of important piece, that we need that voice, the consumer voice, into the creation of standards, which I think is very important.
Okay, I think we'll have to end it there. I want to end it on actually an apology I've been mentioning this URL repeatedly through the session. And before everyone leaves, it's bsigroup.com/net zero, all one word, -UK. Thank you for pointing out that there was actually that was going nowhere. It seems ironic that we're talking about the clarity of information needed to help organizations on the journey, and in my rush to put that URL up there at about 10:30, I put up the wrong address. But thank you. I think we end on a point, which is it's really important, therefore, that government provides a lead, provides signposting where there's good advice available. BSI responds to that, I think, by its existing portfolio of work, but also working with government and with SMEs and businesses more generally to identify where there are gaps on where typically non-standards guidance can still play a part. And I think it is, as you said, Dan, before, this idea of collaboration is the means by which we can accelerate and innovate to net zero. So thank you. As we end on 11:25, I was told to end on the dot. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, for Catherine, for your contribution, and also Seb and Dan as well. I hope this is demystified in some way, and we've got a little bit of a better idea of how we get to net zero through the application of standards by 2050. Thanks for your time, everyone. And I think that's the end of this breakout. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you again. Bye-bye.